in later years, other secular parties came and went. But none of these secular parties had the guts to show Ram Ke Naam on TV as we wanted them to, because we had said that this is important to the country, for the country to see. But the governments of the day, belonging to different political parties, never had the courage to show this film.
Hi, you're listening to State of Southasia, a podcast from Himal Southasian, where we speak to some of the best minds on the region today to unpack crucial issues affecting our politics, cultures, environments, and societies. I'm your host, Nayantara. When a documentary film is still relevant more than 30 years after it was made, it should normally be cause for celebration. But one filmmaker has publicly said that he is disappointed that one of his most acclaimed films from the early 90s is being talked about again as critical commentary on present day India. You may be less surprised when I tell you that the filmmaker is Anand Patwardhan and the film is Ram Ke Naam. For the last 50 years, Anand Patwardhan has been making documentary films on many of the most crucial socio-political issues facing India: the spread of communalism, intolerance, injustice and discrimination, and the resistance to these through anti-caste and rationalist movements, as well as much more. He has won several international accolades, even as some of his films have been banned on Indian television from time to time. Ram Ke Naam was released in 1992, just months before militant Hindu activists demolished a 16th century mosque, the Babri Masjid, in Ayodhya, claiming that it was built on the exact spot where Lord Ram was born. The film covers those frenzied days of the movement to supposedly reclaim the birthplace of Ram, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, and of the BJP leader L.K. Advani's Rath Yatra across India, exhorting Hindus to go to Ayodhya to build a Ram temple. The film captured the hate and hysteria of communalism, the fear and despair of its victims, and the illogic of extremism. On January 22nd this year, Narendra Modi consecrated the Ram temple in Ayodhya as the Prime Minister of India, fulfilling this long-held dream of the Hindu right. Anand Patwardhan is here now to talk about the making of that film, how much and how little has changed since it was released, and what it means for India 32 years later. We are recording this episode on January 30th. Anand, thank you for joining us on this podcast. When you began shooting the film, you couldn't have known that you would end up capturing one of the first attacks on the Babri Masjid. In those initial days, how did you know that you had to make this film?
I was following the rise of religious fundamentalism for quite a few years before the Ram Temple issue began. Around the mid 1980s, I started filming wherever there was communal violence in the country, wherever I could reach. I focused on that, not just communal violence, but the use of religion, revival of religion. So I had actually filmed in Rajasthan when the Sati took place in 1987. I filmed in Punjab where the Khalistan movement was at its peak. And when the Delhi massacre of Sikhs took place, I filmed with the widows after that in Delhi. And so I was generally making films about the rise of the use of religion for political ends and the violence that flowed out of that. So Ram Ke Naam was ended up to be out of all this material that I shot for 10 years, I eventually made 3 films with that material. So one was on Punjab and the situation in Punjab at the time. So that film was called In Memory of Friends, Unna Mitran Di Yaad Pyari, because there Hindus and Sikhs were traveling through the countryside of Punjab, fighting against the Khalistani movement, but also against the state, because ordinary people were trapped in the middle of this fight. And they were spreading the message of Bhagat Singh, who had written Why I'm an Atheist. And he had actually, in the 1920s and 30s, he wrote against the rise of religious fundamentalism. And that class struggle would be a way to fight this. But by the 1990s, when the Hindu upsurge began, by the way, in 1984 itself, Hindu Dharam Sansad, a meeting that took place in Delhi at the time, had already identified Ayodhya as a site where they could reap the dividends of what they were doing by claiming the Babri Mosque. And then they also identified Kashi and Mathura and 3,000 other mosques. So this was going to be a long struggle to essentially to create a Hindu nation. Uh, so, so this finally led to the movement in Ayodhya, which was actually begun in a sense by L.K. Advani, who was a BJP uh, minister, who rode an air-conditioned Toyota across the country, gathering people to go and attack the mosque and build a temple in its place. So I started following that journey, and I filmed in various places where this Toyota, which was disguised as a rath, as a chariot, was traveling, and the mayhem that it caused in its path. People were killed in many places wherever the rath went. And finally, the rath did not actually reach Ayodhya because when it came to Bihar, the chief minister of Bihar, Lalu Prasad Yadav, actually stopped the rath there and arrested L.K. Advani. But the car sevaks, the people who were the so-called pilgrims were actually fanatics who were following this journey to Ayodhya. They continued. So in October 1990, the attack was the date chosen was the 30th of October 1990. We finally were able to get to Ayodhya because actually there was a secular government in power in Uttar Pradesh at the time, which had said that they will protect the mosque. They would, because it was a national monument. The mosque was a declared national monument. So they said it's our constitutional duty to protect this mosque, and we will not allow anybody near that mosque. So there was curfew imposed, everything, and it was difficult for people like us who were considered as journalists and camera people to enter because they were blocking all the. But finally, we managed to get in, and lo and behold, on 30th of October, in fact, on the day before, I could see that thousands of car sevaks were already making their way to Ayodhya. So even though they were supposed to protect the mosque, thousands of people were arriving to do this attack. So we filmed that day's proceedings. I was also lucky enough to film the priest of the Ram temple at the time, who was Pujari Lal Das, who was the temple priest appointed by the court. Because I'll take you back again in time to 1949, soon after Indian independence in 1947. What happened then was in December, on a night in December, the 22nd of December night, some miscreants broke into the mosque and installed Ram idols in the mosque. And then the district magistrate, K.K. Nair, he actually refused to remove the mosques, even though they had been illegally placed. And it turns out he was a Hindutva supporter himself, because years later, after he retired, he became an MLA in the Jan Sangh, which was the earlier version of the BJP. So he joined the Hindu party and so revealed his colors, but he was actually an administrator. He was supposed to have, enforced the law, which he didn't do. The people who had broke and entered the mosque were charged for what they did. They were actually in jail for some time, but then they got bail and they came out. So when I arrived, we were just two of us that went in, myself and Parvez, a friend of mine who was doing sound recording with me. So when we actually, we were again lucky to find one of the priests who installed the idol in the mosque. And he gave us an interview because he was proud of what he had done. Because he was, in fact, a little upset that nobody was paying him any attention. All the glory was being captured by the politicians of the day, the Hindu right-wing politicians, and nobody was remembering that he had installed the idols in the mosque. Because the story they put out, they made propaganda videotapes uh, showing that Ram miraculously appeared in the mosque. And there was a videotape which is included in our film Ram Ke Naam, which shows this baby Ram, a child actor, obviously, dressed up as Ram inside the mosque. And, multiple camera, they had many images of this God to show that what a miraculous person he was. So there was like 6 or 7 little baby Rams inside the mosque. So this videotape was then circulated all over the country to tell people that Ram had miraculously appeared in the mosque. Now, the other background to all this is that while all this was happening, Doordarshan, which is our national TV broadcaster, remember that in those days, uh, TV was restricted. It wasn't multiple channels like we have today. And Doordarshan was the government channel which reached all over the country. So on this government channel, the government was, which was not a BJP government, by the way, this government was showing a Ramayan TV serial. So in the lead up to the assault on the mosque, all over the country, people were watching a Ramayan TV serial, which actually made the Ram's story popular all over the country because people would drop whatever they're doing to watch this TV program. So that this was done by a secular government, which the same government that refused to telecast our film Ram Ke Naam on TV because they said that will create enmity between Hindus and Muslims, which was quite absurd because the film was actually trying to show that the ordinary people of Ayodhya were not fighting amongst each other. Hindus and Muslims had been living there in harmony for decades, for hundreds of years.
Do you think that the government was trying to counter the BJP and Advani's narrative by doing its own promotion of the Ram story?
It's hard to understand because, I mean, the Ramayana TV serial was a depiction of the Ramayana story as told by Tulsidas. Um, and that was written in the 16th century. Tulsidas Ramayana, for the first time in the 16th century, actually reached the ordinary people of North India because it was for the first time it went from Sanskrit text, that was a Valmiki Ramayana.
Valmikis, yes.
Ancient Valmiki Ramayana was a Sanskrit text. So only priests and a few priests could actually knew that story. But it's only after Tulsidas Ramayana that Ram became a popular god. Because up to that point, anywhere in the country, you will not find traces of Ram temples. So this claim that this temple was there through history and through time, and Babur came and demolished it and built a mosque in its place, is absurd because there were hardly any Ram temples anywhere in the country. Because Ram, as I said, was a Sanskrit story, not had not reached the popular imagination till after Tulsidas became popular. And when we reached Ayodhya in 1990, we found many Ram temples, not just one at this spot that they claim to be the birthplace, but there were 20 other temples that claimed that Ram was born here. Because any temple that could establish that Ram was born in its premises would naturally increase its money intake because there would be more pilgrims going to Ram's birthplace. So everyone was claiming this is Ram's birthplace.
Right. So you do point out there are several factors that led up to that moment. The one that you show at the end of the film, and then 2 years later, the demolition of the Babri Masjid. In your film, you show that the October 30th date was chosen because there was also the parikrama that's happening there. So maybe the Kar Sevaks could kind of mingle with other pilgrims.
There were pilgrims coming anyway. That every year pilgrims would come to that site to do the parikrama, which is like a religious, encircling the holy space. and it was a holy pilgrimage. And there's no absolute harm in that, in the sense that it wasn't a violent thing. It had gone on for many, many generations. And even Muslims participated in the parikrama in the old days. Muslims gave water to the devotees. And you see that also in the film, people talking about how there was no enmity between Hindus and Muslims. So again, I tell you that in 1857 was the time when Hindus and Muslims united against the British. It was the what is called the First War of Independence by us, and the British call it the Great Mutiny. So, and the British almost lost that war, and they would have been thrown out of India in 1857, but for the fact that they were able to buy off certain sections, create spies amongst their opponents who would report to them, and so in the end, the British prevailed and did massacres of all the freedom fighters, all those who were fighting against them. If you go back in your history books, you'll see images of people being hung from trees, people being blown up by uh, on cannons, people whoever opposed the British in those days. And ironically enough, two of the people who they executed after they recaptured and after they prevailed in 1857, two of those were people from Ayodhya, one Muslim and one Hindu leader who had built this Hindu-Muslim pact, and they were executed in there's a memorial to them which is now not visible, but um, so this was Baba Amir Ali and Ramcharan Das, uh, who were influential in Ayodhya at the time and were fighting the British. So that memory is completely forgotten in India. Nobody talks about them. Nobody talks about the sacrifice they made and the unity that they made. And in the pact that they put together, finally they agreed that we will not fight about Ram's birthplace. We will both pray in the same location. So Muslims prayed in the same location, and so did Hindus in different sections of that mosque compound. So that prevailed till 1949, when these idols were surreptitiously put into the mosque at night. And after that, the government of the day, Nehru was in power in the center, and Congress was in power in Uttar Pradesh. But still, for some reason, they didn't take it seriously enough, or what, I'm not sure, but they didn't remove the idols. They believed K.K. Nair, who said that removing the idols will cause law and order problems. So those idols remained, but Muslims were allowed to pray in the compound of the mosque, and Hindus were allowed, Muslims were allowed to pray in the mosque, and Hindus were allowed to pray in another part of the compound. So that status quo again got changed in of course, in 1992, as you know, the mosque was demolished completely. Those idols disappeared that they had installed in 1949, and some other idols were put. And then now, recently, before January 22nd, a third set of idols were put. So there's no sanctity to the idols. There can be anything. They just buy it and keep it, or have it made and put it there. And then Mr. Modi came and opened the idol's eyes. So a human being went there to open the eyes of God.
Right. A quick note for those tuning in before we go further. Himal's in depth, independent coverage of the whole of South Asia relies on the support of listeners like you. Please sign up to our newsletters to keep up with our latest stories, podcasts, events, and more. You'll see a sign up link to our newsletters in the episode notes. And you can also sign up by visiting our website at www.himalmag.com. Now, back to our conversation with Anand Patwardhan. On October 30th, 1990, as you have very clearly shown in the film, the police, who were largely of upper caste families, stood down. There is a shot in your film where you can see them retreating after a speech was made by one of the Kar Sevak leaders.
And being congratulated, thanked by the Kar Sevaks, who thanked them after the incident, saying that they allowed us entry. So what had happened was that the government of the day had given orders to stop to save the mosque, not allow it to be attacked. One section of the police was doing its job, and so a few car savaks were killed that day trying to break the mosque. But a large section of the administration and police allowed the entry of thousands of people, hundreds of people in those days. Thousands came 2 years later in December when they actually did the demolition. At that time, by that time, the BJP was in power in the state, and they fully allowed entire demolition to take place.
Right. So we've talked about, what you have shown in the film, but I'd like to ask you, what it was like making the film, what it was like to be among the rather frenzied mobs at the time, what it was like to reach out to other people who were scared about what was happening, who told you that, I think you do speak to a Dalit man who says that this is not what's needed. The building of a Ram temple is not what's needed. What were those moments like to interact with people on both sides of the spectrum? And how did you make decisions of what you were going to shoot, what you were going to keep, how you built this narrative to show, what we see in the film today?
So we were filming whatever we came across. So we were not choosing very carefully because it was in the spur of the moment. All kinds of things were happening. So we were just keeping our camera running and filming, doing interviews randomly with people. Once I realized that there was a caste dimension to what was happening, I slowly understood that. I started asking people their caste after the interview. Most of the time, I asked this question at the end of the interview, not at the beginning. So you hear what their views are, and then you understand who is saying what they're saying, and you realize that by and large, the working class and the so-called lower castes are saying they're not interested in the mosque because, I mean, they in the temple because they never go there. They're not allowed there. So what is it to them? And while the elite castes, I mean the upper caste, whether it's the you know especially the Brahmins and the upper caste, were for the temple being built. So you see this sort of almost clear divide at that time. But unfortunately, I don't think the same situation exists today because the right-wing propaganda has seeped deep into society. They have taken special care because the right wing also understood that their base was limited to the upper caste elite. So they have actually worked hard to include the so-called lower castes in their ranks, especially the OBCs, the other backward castes. They have a big base in the other backward castes now, which they didn't have at that time. So things are much more difficult, and then the communal poison is much deeper today than it was in 1990. The divide between urban and rural is also uh, was clear in those days. It's less clear today, although it still does exist.
In the film, you also kind of puncture the logic. There really isn't very much logic. When you ask several of the Karsevaks about when Lord Ram was born, if they
Right.
believe so strongly that Ayodhya is the birthplace, you try to get them to establish when Ram was born, and they really don't have an answer to that.
I asked them, how come you know exactly where Ram was born when you have no idea of when he was born? So because the answers they gave were thousands of years ago. No, somebody said, no, millions of years ago. And then one of the priests there said it was in Treta Yuga, which is in before history began. So it's as vague as that, before history began. So if it is before history began, then how can you say where the incident took place?
So it is very clear that logic doesn't really play a big part in this kind of rallying of people to take such extreme actions. What do you feel about that? How are so many people drawn towards going and demolishing a structure that has stood for many centuries when there is no logical argument for it?
No, because one particular party and political force, I would say political force because they don't operate only as a political party. It's a hydra-headed uh, monster. in the sense that they have so many wings. There are some are constitutional, some are not constitutional. So they all come together and they're called the Sangh Parivar. They have uh, the RSS, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the Bajrang Dal, and there's so many different offshoots of all of these. So they all came together to do this one job. They were created. Some of them were created exactly for this purpose. Like Bajrang Dal was created actually for this, and they are also a kind of caste divided organizations because the RSS largely has Brahmin leadership. The Vishwa Hindu Parishad also has upper caste leadership. Bajrang Dal has OBCs, other backward castes, and sometimes some Dalits. So they have different people who have to do different tasks. And by the way, there's not just my film. There was a sting operation done, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago by Cobra Post, um, where they actually interviewed the people who had done the demolition on hidden camera. They interviewed, uh, talked to these people, and they understood that the RSS had actually made sure that some of their followers died that day. They put them in the front, knowing that there'll be police fighting them, and some people will be killed. And then they had a plan, which they implemented, of taking the ashes of those whom they said had been killed by the state all over the country in another chariot journey to commemorate the martyrs of those who were trying to liberate the Babri Mosque. So these are all kind of part of their arsenal of how to build up the frenzy.
Sure, but also among people who responded to this call, the Sang's call, to go to Ayodhya on October 30th. I mean, we say so much now that we live in a post-truth world, but there's so much of an element of post-truth in that, where actually people don't really care about fact.
Yeah, so that's why I always say that this whole movement has nothing to do with religion. Religion is just the dressing on the top. It's all about political power capture and financial power capture. Because again, as I told you, any temple that established that Ram was born here would get huge donations. And huge amount of money was made in this whole Ayodhya process. And that is also documented in the film. An interview with the income tax officer who had actually found held the Vishwa Hindu Parishad guilty of embezzlement of the funds that were raised to build the Ram temple, that people had eaten up this money. The priest of the temple also made that allegation that people were building their own houses with the bricks that uh, the the devotees had sent to donate to build the temple were actually used up for building their own houses and to put in their own accounts. Uh, and the income tax officer also talks about how he was sidelined. He was actually taken off the job because he had found them, in breach of the rules because they had raised money from abroad. They had raised money in England and America through their devotees who were being money that was being sent to build the temple, and that was not allowed by the Reserve Bank of India because they were going against the rules of bringing in foreign exchange, bringing in money from abroad. So all of these facts have been forgotten today.
Anand, I was in school at the time that this happened, but from what I remember, after the demolition of the Babri Masjid and in the 90s, there was a sense that the people who had done this were on the fringe. They were the extreme elements. Is that how you saw it as well while making this film? And of course, has the fringe become more mainstream now, 30 years later?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, yes, we did think that that was the fringe. And we did think, I mean, even when I was there on October 30, 1990, I was hoping that, good sense would prevail in the whole country and that the film that we were making would be a good and timely warning about what would happen if you keep appeasing the fundamentalist forces. Uh, I probably was wrong that it was a deeper penetration of the movement even in those days than I gave uh, credence to. But still, they were, the election results in those early days show that they were not popular because even after the first attack, the BJP didn't win the election. They won. They won this. Yes, they won later uh, and put their own. BJP government had come to power by 1992, and they enabled the demolition. But even after that, they didn't stay in power long. Um, and they in later years, other secular parties came and went, but none of these secular parties had the guts to show Ram Ke Naam on TV as we wanted them to, because we had said that this is important to the country, for the country to see. But the governments of the day, belonging to different political parties, never had the courage to show this film. Finally, we went to court, and the court ruled in 1997 that they had to not only show the film, they had to show it on at prime time on national TV. So in 1997, the film was broadcast. And I still meet people today who saw the film that day on TV. Uh, the judges ordered that it be shown at prime time. And so at 9 p.m., people saw the film, and many people saw it across the country because, as I said, in those days, there was still more Doordarshan watching than any other channel. But that was just the one single TV telecast. Had there been a secular, genuinely secular government, they would have shown films like this. Mine is not the only film that was made in that vein. There were other things like that, which were fighting the rise of fundamentalism. But these things never made their way to the national consciousness.
Right. So, if we could trace that from, what happened in the early 90s to this moment, the consecration of the temple on Jan 22nd, 2024, where it's become almost a mainstream accepted idea, to some people even inevitable, that this temple should have always been there. The opposition to that, the kind of reminders of the price we've paid for that, is a whimper at most. There are other factors that have contributed to this trajectory. One of the things may be that, along with the tremors to secularism in the early 90s, there was also the shift from the kind of Nehruvian socialism to, we liberalized our economy. And tell us a little bit about how that played into this whole
Absolutely, you're absolutely right.
phenomenon.
That 1980s, I identified 1980s when they identified the places that would be controversial, that they could reap some benefits out of: the Ayodhya temple, Kashi and Mathura, all these religious sites that they could create a conflict out of. Now, this is the same period where the previous economic model, which was a kind of mixed economy of private and public partnership, private elements as well as public, ownership of many things, like including the banks had been nationalized by the government. There were many things that actually were creating a unique economic experiment of a mixed political economy between private and public. And by the 80s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union on the one hand, the fact that China went down the capitalist road, started to change from Mao's China to China that, where Mao himself met Nixon and there was an American partnership going on. And slowly the Chinese economy was built around capitalist model. So the idea of socialism itself had become unpopular, was becoming unpopular, and the privatization process was in full swing, was gathering force. And in this period, I don't think it's an accident that the rise of religious fundamentalism all over the world and ethnic identity issues all over the world came to the forefront, because as the idea of socialism as a glue to create a society was denigrated, was I not that I'm a supporter of Stalinism or any kind of the excesses that the left did in the countries where they were in power. I believe in a democratic system, but the idea that socialism itself was a horrible word had taken root, and it was replaced by religious identity everywhere. As this shift was taking place, religion was getting more and more important. Ethnic identity was getting more and more important. And because, in my view, the world is controlled by the arms industry, and it started many, many decades back. The collapse of the Soviet Union was bad because it shifted the balance of power. In, there was only one superpower, and they were calling the shots. And in India, that played out. So you had the rise of Hindu fundamentalism, you had the rise of Sikh fundamentalism in Punjab, you had different ethnic identity issues being raised all over the country, and the glue that held us together was falling apart.
Right. You have, of course, we've been talking about Ram Ke Naam so much, but you have made several films. I mean, you spoke about the films that you had already made before that. You have continued to do that. There's Jai Bhim Comrade, there is Reason or Vivek, as it is in Hindi. So my question was, what has it been like to continue to work in this space where you are talking about people who have either been perpetrating religious extremism or have been the victims of that? And it keeps happening. What has it been like for you to work in that space?
The thing that bothers me about my own films is the fact that they're so badly underutilized. The viewership has never reached a critical mass where, like, the whole country has seen it, or at least the large sections of society have seen it and can debate it and discuss it. It has never reached that. We are still in the margins in terms of the viewership. Whatever, the one day it was shown on Doordarshan was the only time that this film got a mass screening. But that was back in 1997, one evening. By and large, and even though activists show the film, even in the last 1 week, there have been many attempts to show Ram Ke Naam all over the country. And these attempts have been met by violence from the right wing, by the support to the right wing by the police. So many of the screenings were stopped halfway. People were arrested. People were beaten up in different places. So it happened to my knowledge, it happened in Hyderabad. It happened in Kerala. So one state is Congress ruled, the other state is left ruled. It happened in Pune, which is, of course, Maharashtra is the right wing is in power. And it happened in Ashoka University in Delhi. Again, halfway the screening was stopped. But the positive thing is that all these places, the people continued to try to show the film. So if it got stopped one day, they went and showed it the next day. They managed to, because you can't actually fully suppress a film like this, which is on the net. At least so far not. If we were in Kashmir, they would have done it. They would have banned the internet. But here, right now, they've not reached that stage for the whole country. So the film does get seen, but it's not a critical mass. It's not like the Ramayana, which got shown, or the Mahabharata, which got shown, the epics for every week, prime time, the whole country was stop and watch TV. So that's the power of cinema. And and that power has never been harnessed by films like mine.
Do you get trolled for your work, for what you say?
Of course, yeah. But trolls where in the few places where the films are shown, like whether it's YouTube or Facebook, there is you can see the comments. So they get trolled that way. Those kind of things will happen.
Have these kind of angry or violent reactions, are they worse in the internet era than they were in the 90s?
No, in the 90s there was no internet of that kind. So you couldn't gauge it. Today there's all of this stuff which we feel happy that we have the internet because at least we can get our stuff out a little bit. But the right wing has far greater access to that same internet. all the stuff that they're doing is done through the WhatsApp university. Every bit of fake news is multiplied millions of times through the internet or the phone system. The fact that I'm worried that they predict that in a few years every Indian will be on the net. The net penetration, which is right now I think at about 48%, is going to hit 100% very shortly. And that means the amount of people brainwashed by those who are controlling who have the money to, after all, censorship doesn't happen just because the government has a censor board. Like all our films have to go through censor procedure. Uh, but censorship doesn't happen only through the state. It happens through who has the money, who will spend the money to advertise, to get the eyeballs, to buy space and put it out there. Just like you can't read a single newspaper without having Narendra Modi's picture on the front page, a paid advertisement. Every paper. Image of the Prime Minister is on every billboard, whether it's a petrol pump or anything. You can't walk around without seeing this face.
So someone always benefits from movements like these that are supposedly about faith. Who benefited in the Ram Janmabhoomi movement in the late 80s and 90s? Who were the beneficiaries? Who are the beneficiaries now, according to you?
So even in those in the film, it says that by a single issue of Ram Temple, they went from 2 seats in Parliament to 88. And then from 88, they went much higher, and finally they came to power. They had a single issue till the time that they actually came to power. Now they have a few more issues. Now they're talking about development. And for them, development is just enabling the billionaires of this country. That is what they call development. Giving all the resources to Mr. Adani and Mr. Ambani is their idea of development. And they have undermined even the little good that the Congress did in the past, like the Manrega, the employment guarantee scheme, the fact that people could have jobs. They've undermined that. We have huge amount of joblessness. Today we have the only kind of real jobs that are available are in the security forces, whether in the army or the police or the guards of rich people's houses, the housing, the gated communities that employ security guards. So this is the place where working class people can get jobs. You actually have riots of people who are trying to get into the army because that's a secure job. So it's actually scary to think of the future where this continues, because we could end up with genocide because we're headed in that direction, the kind of hatred against the Muslim community that is now being spread all across the country.
You talked about the court-appointed priest, Lal Das, who really was talking the language, very heartfelt secularism.
Secularism, I would call him a liberation theologist. He was using the idiom of religion. He was the priest. He was saying Ram didn't stand for all this. And, you can interpret Ram in the way that he was doing, which is that Ram was the king who wanted to help everybody. That he didn't care whether you were poor or rich or anything, that Ram was for all. So by that logic, Ram was in, even the Muslims would have meaning Ram cared about all creatures. That was his interpretation of Ram.
Right. And again, on Jan 22nd this year, when as the consecration of the Ram Mandir was happening, there was a social media conversation about this man who very unfortunately was murdered a year after the events that you recorded.
2 years after the event, because I recorded in 1990, the mosque was demolished in 92, and Pujari Lal Das was murdered in 93.
Right, okay.
At the time, for a while even after I had done the interview, and when I was doing the interview, and for a few years later, he had bodyguards because he was already under threat because of his views. And in fact, the first screening that I ever did of Ram Ke Naam was done in Lucknow, where he came to the screening. And I asked him, said, now you're on the screen and people are going to see what you're saying. And isn't that dangerous for you? What do you think? And he, laughed and he said, I'm so happy that you made this film. And you're, I said what I said because I believe in it. And I want you to spread the film. I want you to say it. I'm not afraid of anyone.
We've talked about, the communalism versus secularism, but do you think in the 30 years between the making of the film and now, 34 years?
4 years since I shot
Yes.
in 1990 and it's now 2024.
Yes. So in that time, has the idea of secularism itself changed for us?
No, it's become a bad word. I
Mm.
mean, many people don't want, I mean, they know it's written in the Constitution, but they want to pretend that Indira Gandhi inserted those words, that the original Constitution didn't, Dr. Ambedkar didn't have it in the Constitution. The reason Dr. Ambedkar didn't have it in the Constitution in 1950 is because the whole Constitution is suffused with the idea of secularism. It wasn't necessary. It was not at that moment deemed like you have to put it in words.
It didn't have to be explicit.
It didn't have to be explicit because it's implicit in all parts of the Constitution. The Constitution believes in equality. I mean, and liberty, equality, and fraternity was there from the beginning. But the word has become denigrated, and even in the film, L.K. Advani calls us pseudo secularists, and that became a popular term. So I actually have a shot where L.K. Advani is making the speech, say again pseudo secularists, and the camera focuses on the chariot wheel of his Toyota, which is a painted wheel, and then comes down and shows the tire underneath. The actual reality is that it's a Toyota car and not a chariot. That is pseudo religion.
Right. So again, earlier this month, when everyone was heading to Ayodhya and all this, the ceremonies were happening there. There was a lot of, on TV and otherwise, there was the term used was the movement of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement has culminated in the temple at Ayodhya now, but it hasn't really culminated, right? Because people now are talking about the Gyanvapi mosque, temples in Kashi and Mathura.
Yeah, there's 3,000 more mosques on the list. And
Mm.
when they run out of those 3,000, they will find some other way to demonize Muslims because they need some community to demonize. And it's no longer fashionable to demonize the Dalits. It's not politically acceptable for them to talk against Dr. Ambedkar or, they do oppress the Dalits still. Dalits are still killed in the countryside and even in the cities, forced to commit suicide as Rohit Vemula did. And so all that is happening, but in terms of political language, they're very careful about not offending the Dalit community. And they're politically also, they're trying to, and the backward caste, as I said, they're putting key people in power that will then give them that vote.
So I think this is all the more reason that your film is being circulated. Once again, I think more than in the last few years. All the more reason for everyone to watch it. It's an absolutely brilliant film, and I know that you said that you're disappointed that it's still relevant, but I think it still has a lot of work to do. Before I let you go, if I can just ask you, what are three films that you have enjoyed watching that you would recommend to others?
What are well, I watch a lot of documentaries rather than fiction. I do like some of the fiction that is there, and there's some good fiction films that are being made now also. But there's a huge number of very powerful documentaries being made that, again, the problem with documentaries is that they don't get airtime of it. They're not easy to find and they're not easy to very few groups all over the country are actually showing these films enough, but they are being made.
So, any standout films in the recent or older ones that come to mind?
Yeah, there's quite a few. Not why it would be unfair to just talk about one or two, but I saw a film on the police attacks on the Aligarh Muslim University, a student from Jamia. eras has made that film. But there's another film that I'm hoping to see, which is on the Shaheen Bagh resistance, um, which I will soon see. I have got it now, but I haven't watched it yet. And yeah, there are plenty of very powerful. I just came from a festival in Kolkata that organized documentary screenings, and it was houseful on each of the days, and very powerful films that were shown there. Some older and some new ones.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for spending so much time and having this in depth conversation with us.
My pleasure.
That was filmmaker Anand Patwardhan speaking to Himal Southasian for the State of Southasia podcast. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. You can find many more stories on the politics of the Ram Mandir on our website www.himalmag.com. You can also read reportage and analysis from across South Asia, listen to our other podcasts, and sign up for our newsletters to keep up with Himal's work. We'll be back in 4 weeks with another in-depth conversation on the next episode of State of South Asia. Thank you for listening and see you then.